Hey, MBA hopefuls, we are on the air with MBA Waves, your weekly vidcast talking all things business and education, streaming live every Tuesday on LinkedIn, Facebook, and YouTube. Today, we'll be talking to GRE expert Andrew Culford about just why you should choose the GRE for your MBA and business school applications in general. On this 116th episode, we're going to learn the logic of the GRE versus the GMAT decision, and the new format of the GRE. And please don't forget to hit that like button if you enjoyed this week's episode. Be sure to click subscribe to stay on top of all the free tips that we have to offer and to get up close and personal with some of the world's top-ranked business schools. I'm your host for today, Eric Lucrezia, joined by my co-host, Bara Sapir. How you doing, Bara?
I'm doing good. It's good to see you and good to meet you, Andrew.
Likewise.
Speaking of Andrew, joining us all the way from sunny California is Andrew Culford, founder and head coach at Test Prep Studios in Los Angeles, and streaming to the world with his daily dose of GRE problem-solving videos, making life, especially the GRE, just a little bit easier for all of us. How are you doing, Andrew?
I'm doing well, Eric. That's my goal, and great to be here. Thanks, Bara.
You're welcome. First of all, before we get into the tests, what drew you into test prep coaching and why the GRE in particular?
Yeah, so I started out in New York City teaching the SAT and ACT, so the high school tests, and I did that for quite a few years. I found, though, the most unpleasant part of my job was dealing with parents. And I'm sure, Barry, you can attest to this if you've been in the test prep world. There was always sort of this weird triangular relationship where you have the student, the teacher, and the parent. So about 5 years ago, I moved into grad school tests, GRE and GMAT, and I love working with grownups because they do their homework. They are the ones who want to be there, and there's none of that sort of, awkward three-way relationship.
Right. Yeah. We love parents, especially when they're paying. But no, what I mean by that is sometimes it's hard for them to balance letting their kid, that's the point, right? Student stand on his or her own 2 feet. And so that can be a challenge sometimes. And I have a little follow-up question because I know besides the coaching, you're also an actor. And I wondered if that plays into your approach in coaching.
I am. So as like my origin story, right? I moved to New York City with nothing but, a dream. And my first instinct was to get a job as a waiter. But I applied to several waiting jobs and I just wasn't cut out for it. So I thought back to my high school experience and how I kind of enjoyed taking tests. And that's kind of how I paid my rent for all those years that I lived in New York City.
Nice.
Yeah.
So I have a question. Did you work for one of the big test prep companies?
I have worked for somewhat like boutique companies. So in New York, I was with a company called Academic Approach. Mm-hmm. And then when I moved over to doing GRE before I started my own thing, I was with Veritas Prep. Mm-hmm. So that's been my experience. I've never worked for, Veritas was subsequently bought by Varsity. Kaplan. I guess technically I have worked for one of the big sort of retail ones, but my experience has always been sort of that bespoke test prep company.
Right. Yeah. Because I started in New York. Well, I started in Ann Arbor working for Princeton Review. Okay. And so it's super interesting that you're also a thespian, an actor, mm-hmm. because I remember that for TPR, we had to audition. Yeah. And we had to actually, I still remember that we needed to teach something that was non-academic. Mm-hmm. And so I remember I taught, how do you talk to people you don't know at a party and have a good time? Ooh. Right? And really the people...
Networking 101.
There you go.
Right? And the reason that TPR hired people was not only for their scores, but their ability to just be in front of the classroom, because it was mostly classroom teaching. And so it's a lot of the folks were actors, right? Or like stand-up comics or, using their material on the students in between question sets. So I know how that goes. What would you say are the three things that you love about the GRE? We're going to compare notes here.
Yeah, sure. So I'd say what I love most about the GRE, and this is relative to GMAT, is its straightforwardness, mm-hmm. right? The GMAT, and we'll probably get more into this, is is a tricky test. There's a lot of gamesmanship that goes into it. So I love the fact that it is straightforward. I love that the scope of material is pretty limited, right? You're not having to relearn or rather learn any new math. It's more about relearning the math that you might have forgotten since 10th or 11th grade. And finally, I'd say that it's been around so long that there are not only a lot of resources, not practice tests and test prep company resources, but also like a pretty rigorous online discussion about questions. And so I always tell my students, if you come across a question, there is almost certainly a post online, people debating back and forth about what the correct answer is. And just reading those is a very, very valuable exercise.
Yeah, I always tell people that they need to pick the least wrong answer, not the best answer in the vocabulary. Like math, it's finite. Yep. But I like your answers. It's fun. It's always fun to talk to other people who know this test so intimately.
Yeah.
Because there's not that many. I mean, there's a lot of us, but we've been in the field for a long time. I love the GRE because the reading comprehension sections I think are more interesting than some of the other tests that are out there. Like I just think that they're just more varied than the LSAT and the MCAT is just like eating sawdust. And the GMAT is usually more businessy related, whereas you just have like more. It's like I think of it like the SAT on steroids. I also love that when you're studying it and you have to study vocabulary, you're just feeling better, and it's great to just always be improving your vocabulary anyway. I think that's fun. And then I like the math part, the when the ABCD, like when you have to figure out, like it depends. Like I like the, like that reminds me a little bit of the LSAT. It's also a little bit like the GMAT, but I find that it's like a brain tickler in like the best way, like a brain massager. So absolutely. I enjoy, those are the things that I like about it.
All right, Andrew, let's reel it in here. Like what's the GRE really seeking to test? We got the math questions, the verbal questions. Like, do we want to know how good I'm at algebra? How well I can conjugate verbs? I'm sure not. So like, what are they seeking to test in the GRE, really?
Yeah, and it's a great question. And Bara was sort of touching on this with the idea of like a brain tickler, right? The quantitative comparison questions. The bottom line is that the GRE is really looking to test your reasoning ability. And that's in the name of the sections. If you look at the practice books, it's called the quantitative reasoning section, the verbal reasoning section. It's not the quantitative, how much algebra do you know and how much obscure vocabulary do you know section. It's about seeing how you think. Now it seems sort of counterintuitive that there are so many questions that involve this difficult vocabulary, but when I'm working with students and I'm working on vocab questions or difficult algebra questions, I always like to zoom out and say, what is this really asking about here? Because even if you don't know every single vocab word on there, you can use some pretty logic-based strategies to eliminate all the wrong answers and leave yourself with the correct one.
Yeah, I mean, like looking at the GMAT for comparison, I mean, similarly, there's the quantitative section, there's math stuff being asked, there's grammar, there's sentence completion, there's the writing section in the old version, which is being phased out, as many of us know. And yet the GMAT, in theory, aims to test business competency, strategy, being strategic. There's a different approach. You have the test. Sorry, you have for taking the test. Do you choose to guess or not? Can you eliminate enough questions to make a guess worthwhile, or are you going to take the penalty for getting it wrong? Right? There's a time management element to it. There's an endurance element to it, right? Being focused for that much time. Would you say the GRE is similar in this way? Because the GRE is also much broader. It's not just about business skills, right? It's a test that's used for people going to grad school in many domains, from education to biology to whatever. So how would you compare?
Yeah. So time management, decision making, all of that do come into play on the GRE, but the GMAT is very, very particular in the way that it does that. It's a much more aggressive way of, I'll say, of testing those skills. What's nice about the GRE is that the questions themselves do focus on this logic, as I was talking about, but you don't have to worry as much, especially now with the new version, about that sort of I'll call it those sprinkles on top, right? With the GMAT, you're in this constant battle of, is this question worth answering? I have to decide now. On the GRE, for instance, you're allowed to skip around from question to question, and that I found with my students really removes a lot of the extra stress of the test.
Nice.
That makes sense. What level do you find that of math and vocabulary that the students who, I mean, obviously all students are different, but what do you find are the, how much do you find that they need to relearn or refresh on?
Right. Yeah. And so what I was saying before is 10th, 11th grade math. I'm going to actually even say 9th and 10th grade math is like the heart and soul of this test. So in general, there's a correlation between how recently you saw that math, right? And how well you do on the test. So I find that students who are just out of undergrad or even in senior year do not have to relearn a lot. The Pythagorean theorem comes right back to them. They recently took the SAT or ACT, so they have a lot of the reading comp strategies. I find that it's the students who are in their 30s plus who have the biggest struggle of having to reconnect with that math.
Makes sense.
Yeah, it's also, I don't know if you find this, but sometimes it's just also the anxiety that people have about the math, that they actually know it and that they just have this anxiety that they're not going to know it. And it's getting them more confident and focused on really believing in themselves, knowing, well, you did this in 7th, 8th, 9th, and 10th grade. Like, you did this, right? So it's going to be okay. But they might have just these nightmares from their past of math that we have to get them over.
Totally. And I'm sure you can probably speak more to this, but even beyond math, like your experience with a particular teacher, right? Like maybe Mr. So-and-so made me cry in 9th grade. And that's inextricably linked to quadratic equations now, right? Like I can't undo that. Yeah.
Completely.
Oh my God. Formative years trauma. Anyway,
did I bring something up in you there, Eric? Was that a little?
Yeah, I'm trembling on the side.
Okay.
No,
should we speak? Should we talk? Should we unpack this, Eric? What do you want to do?
Well, this is like your thing, right? You do like, stress management and like dealing with anxiety, testing, which is like a fantastic niche because there's so many people that struggle with that. But I'm imagining how many people are anxious right now because of the new test. First of all, I have to say it's super interesting that both GMAC, the creators of the GMAT, and ETS, the creators of the GRE, and TOEFL, by the way, these three tests are all being like redone at the same time. I'm sure there's no coincidence that it's following COVID. Testing has been under the microscope for decades in terms of, is it useful? Is it fair? Is it a lot of things, right? And I guess COVID was that catalyst that pushed these two companies to make the change. That said, thinking about what you guys do as coaches, as trainers on these tests, it must be a major challenge because now you have to learn it again or make some adjustments. I know there's sections that haven't changed, but there's got to be a new approach to the strategy of this, and I'm wondering how you're dealing with that. And part two of my question is, as an applicant, should I worry about the format of the new versus the old? So you can tackle this beast of a question however you want, Andrew.
Yeah. So first off, I would say everyone take a deep breath. Nothing yeah, there we go. Nothing content wise is changing. So any studying for the GRE that you've done up until now will serve you just as well on the new test. Literally the only thing that's changing is they're getting rid of they're getting rid of one of the essays, which, and I'll punt this over to you. Like admissions wise, I don't know how much the schools care about the essay score. So they're getting rid of one of the essays. They're getting rid of the experimental section, which I won't go into, but it's just another way that the test stresses you out. And they're shortening the verbal and quant sections. So you just need to keep studying the way that you've been studying. ETS recently put up a new Power Prep practice test, so you can see exactly what it looks like. The one downside that seems to be stressing quite a few of my students out is the idea that there's a little less margin for error now, right? So whereas before, if you made a quote unquote like silly mistake, 1 or 2 questions, it wouldn't completely sink your score. Whereas now, like you really got to be careful, right? Because you only get 12.
There's fewer questions.
Exactly.
So where at first it was, or previously it was a kind of a drop in the ocean, maybe now, and of course this is exaggeration for making the point, but if there's fewer questions, a mistake stands out more or has more impact. So yeah. So what's your approach there, dealing with this one drawback that you as you describe it? What's some advice about this? How do you handle this?
Yeah, I would say practice. To use the overused quote, practice. The way you practice is the way you play. So when you're practicing for the test, if you're planning to take the test in a testing center, some people prefer that experience to being in your bedroom. I would say try to recreate that as much as you can, right? Like maybe go to a nice quiet library or a WeWork, right? Rent a room or something like that to really just get the experience of being in a quiet room with other people, so that you can figure out where the snags are before it's game day.
Absolutely. Yeah. Good advice. Yeah.
I was going to say also that students don't have a choice, right? Because they have to take the new GMAT, the new GRE, right? They don't have an option anymore.
Exactly.
It's not like the GMAT where it's like there's this overlap of when you can take the old one or the new one. So, worrying is praying for something you don't want. So you don't necessarily want to worry about something that you can't change or have any impact on. Like, this is what the test is, and this is what you need. This is what you need to work with. I was also going to say, Eric, I don't know if you know, but like the SAT is changing, and the ACT is going to be going through some kind of change also. That might be a digital version that they're already using in some cases, but it just seems like the whole landscape is really changing. I haven't heard anything about some of the other tests, but really it's quite extraordinary to have so many tests make this shift. And as we've talked about with ETS and with GMAT, like, wow, this was an interesting marketing decision. Like ETS first came on and they knew that they were changing, but didn't tell us. And then they came on and they're like, yeah, we knew all along, So it's just an interesting, it was the GMAT changes, it's new, it's shiny, people are excited about it or scared about it. And then the ETS followed suit. It looks like a marketing decision to me.
Yeah. Pepsi and Coke, right?
Totally.
Yeah. Totally. I won't ask which is which. And we won't have to say that. But no, they both have an important, role to play in the market, in education, and in assessment in general. It is the bane of the existence of many people. People recognize that one of my biggest criticisms, I would say, of these tests is that they don't measure any of the soft skills, any of the real important things. Like, do you have leadership potential? Can you inspire a team? Are you organized? Do you manage your time well? Well, okay, time management, yes. What kind of international experiences have you had? And none of this can be assessed by these tests. So, or perhaps the lack of ability, if you're a foreign student about to study in an English-speaking country, that's international experience already. But besides that, it has its limitations. Yet, until someone figures out something better, this is what we have. The other thing, even though, and when I used to work at Essex Business School, and now as an admissions consultant, it's because my clients or people who are looking to do an MBA, and a lot of people obsess over these tests, over the GMAT or the GRE, and we say, while it is an important thing, the interview is usually something even more important. these tests, you have to have a certain minimum score, and there usually is no official minimum score at any of these schools. Whether we're talking about M7s or schools that are ranked maybe 80s or 90s, there's usually no official score. It is the full composite picture, but there has to be a balance of enough positive data points on the applicant's profile to be admissible. And I think that's one of the first things, is that the test is a sign that you're admissible. The school, the admissions committee above all, wants to make sure that you're going to be able to handle some of the tougher classes like finance and economics and so forth. That's what the test often is about. And that interview, your shortlisted for the interview, is are you desirable? Are you somebody they want to welcome into the program? Do you fit in? It's kind of the making sure process.
Sure.
So both are important. And I think a lot of people give a lot of importance to tests and not enough to the research and the reflection process, which is very much about finding the school which is the best fit for you, where you're A, more likely to be admitted, B, more likely to be happy and therefore successful and gainfully employed after the fact. So
100%. And just to add to that, so I work with quite a few MBA applicants, and the first question I ask them is, have you spoken to someone more knowledgeable about admissions than I am? Because my lane is the test, and I stay in it, right? I don't do what you do, Eric, and I'm certainly going to be sending more people your way, but it is important to have that overview of someone who has like a bird's eye view to say like, okay, well, here's your work experience, here's your GPA. Given these, this is a realistic score for you on the test. And it's so helpful for me to know that up front, because a lot of times people come to me and be like, I need to knock this out of the park. And I say, well, do you really? Or is there enough strength in the rest of your application that, like a score in the high 150s, low 160s is A-okay?
Really important point. If we're talking about schools or programs that are test optional, if this was like a conversation about test optional conversation, we're talking say 5-10 years ago, my first response would be like, okay, you have to call into question what kind of quality controls does school have in place? Like, anonymous school X, we don't know what it's ranked, right? But they're just saying, oh, you don't need to take a test. What does that mean? Do they really care about the quality of the people who are going to be in the program? And I think that's something that you really need to consider. I mean, the information you're going to learn in any program, you could probably find for free online or in a book or in YouTube videos. It's really very much about the people with whom you're studying, the professors, the alumni, the corporate partners, all of those people in their various capacities that are going to make your experience that much richer, have those connections that are more significant, that are going to get the job and the prestige of the network. So quality control is like a thing, right? Fast forward to COVID, post-COVID, there's a very different take on this. A lot of schools temporarily had a waiver, or just they just didn't require the test. Some schools put it back post-COVID. Other schools still allow alternative tests. So besides GMAT and GRE, which are accepted at nearly every MBA program and master's in business, some schools are also still accepting MCATs, LSAT Series 7, and so forth. Some schools have their own psychometrics tests. So lots of different options. We've had an episode on MBA Waves before, I think twice at this point now, because we're like 2.5 years into this game, where we spoke about what does that mean? What are the ramifications of taking a test waiver? First of all, a lot of people consider the GMAT/GRE your kind of first MBA class. It's that healthy warm up for your brain and getting you ready for some of the tougher classes you're going to be taking during the program. Then again, it is also that filter to be sure that your classmates are going to be at the same level or higher than you, to inspire you and push you to be the better version of yourself. But also, what about post-degree? There are some top firms like MBB, so McKinsey, Bain, BCG, that look at these test scores for hiring. So if you're looking to work at some of these top firms in consulting, investment banking, corporate finance, this is also a factor to consider as well. Now, sometimes I have this conversation with my clients who are considering test optional programs. I say, well, let's look at your profile. What kind of academics do you have in your undergrad? What other experience you have? And if you have a stellar, academic report, transcript, sorry, and all the other aspects of your application are really strong. You write good essays, you interview well, you've had great experiences, leadership, international exposure, and so forth, then that's somebody that probably can, not rest on their laurels, but
Yeah.
depend on the other aspects of their application and not so basically take a test waiver. In other words, not go for it. But if you don't have the grades as high as you'd like them to be, the test is an opportunity to prove to the admissions committee that you can hack it.
Yep.
And so it'll be that compensation factor.
Let's get into the weeds.
Here we go.
Let's go, Bara.
Yeah. So what materials do you have students work with? What do you recommend to them? Let's compare notes here.
Totally. I say the first dollar you should spend on your preparation is the official books, right?
Absolutely.
Right. So Kaplan, Princeton, Magoosh, like all fine, all great imitations of the real thing, but they're not the real thing. Mm-hmm. So if you're going to spend any money on GRE prep, it should be on those official books. You can get them as the it's called the GRE Power Pack, which has three books, so much material there. And then the free Power Prep tests online at ets.org. And then there are a few Power Prep tests that you can pay for. If you're looking for like supplemental material or a way to, to tackle the test in a sort of methodical way, I'll plug my own course right here. I have a full curriculum that I teach both in live and recorded video format. And then one other supplemental book, and Bara, I'm sure you as well have your own sort of process for that. But the other supplemental material that I really do like is the Manhattan 5-pound book, because it's pure practice. If you need to get better at triangles, there's a chapter that you can go to and do 30 questions on it. The one warning I will say about materials is for verbal, stick to official practice. A math question is pretty easy to imitate, right? You change the name, you change the numbers, and all of a sudden, boom, it's a new math question. But and I do get into this in my course quite a bit. The verbal questions are crafted so carefully. They're crafted like equations. And I've found sometimes those imitation materials don't do a great job of imitating the exactness with which the verbal questions are created by ETS.
I totally, completely agree with all that. We do have some of our own material, and we also have a speed reading platform that we use with students that we created, because time management is there's a couple ways to move through time management, but reading faster with great comprehension is really going to just boost your score on the entire test, and certainly on reading. So I'm going to send you a demo to check that out, because
I'd love to check that out.
Yeah, we have a GRE track, and a lot of our GRE students are typically business school students who don't want to take the GMAT.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And so they kind of have learned some of the material, and then there's that shift that happens. But I agree with everything that you've said. Like, the official material is the most important, because even on an unconscious level, you're picking up things from the questions that are being asked on all the tests, right? On all the tests, the official material. And so you learn to understand the cadence, even though it's gone through so many different editions and editing and going through with the different people who are working on making these questions. But what was interesting when we had ETS here, like, they're not their data bank, Eric, correct me if I'm wrong, but I mean, they just said that they just have enough questions, that they're not, that's why they don't have the experimental section anymore.
Exactly. We had ETS on a couple months ago, and that's exactly what they said, that's why they cut the experimental section. So if you've never heard of the experimental section before, don't even worry about it, because it doesn't exist anymore. And unlike GMAT, which is doing this sort of like overlap period, right now you can do both, and they'll be phasing out the old version of the test probably sometime in Q1, they said, right? So February, March. I thought they said Q1, but anyway, it's old GMAT, old GRE is done. It's over, like as of 3 days ago. Yeah, it's very cut. I also wanted to share that. Oh, I think we just lost Bara, but anyway, the speed reading track they have is called Mindflow, and it's fantastic. I tried out the beta version like a year or so ago, and it's wonderful. Just sharing it, Bara's back. Just sharing about Mindflow and the name of it. I just popped it on the screen there. But coming back to GRE, I wanted to ask you, Andrew, how much prep time would I need to prepare for the GRE as a native English speaker like myself, or if English were my second language? How would you describe this?
Yeah, so that's a great question, and one that I'm going to give the kind of squirmy answer. It depends. It depends where you're starting, and it depends where you need to go. So I would say those are questions that you need to start with. Like, what score do I need? Talk to an advisor who can look at what programs you're applying to, your background, the whole package, and say, here's what you need. And then once you have figured that out, what I would say is to cover, and I'm giving very broad answers here, so I don't want anyone to think this is like the prescriptive way to study for the GRE for everybody, because it does depend. If you're someone who needs to catch up on quite a bit, so if you need like an A to Z review of the test, I would say it probably takes about 2 months or so just to cover that material, and you're practicing along the way. And then beyond that, it might take you a few more months to practice the strategies, right? And get very, very good at them. That could be like 6 to 8 months. That could be a pretty long GRE journey if you're coming back to math and you haven't touched it in 10, 15, 20 years. If you are someone who, and this happens, you take a diagnostic test and you're a few points off where you need to be, like, then it's just a matter of fine tuning those difficult questions. And figuring out where those weaknesses are. And I'm gonna share a strategy that, and Bear, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. For those students, for the student who comes to me saying like, hey, I need to get to 160 and I'm at 158 or 157. A lot of times I'll have them very selectively work with some GMAT material, because the GMAT practice material is question adaptive. And it very quickly gets you to difficult questions. And of course, you're skipping the data sufficiency, the ones that don't come up on the GRE. But as a way to practice with some more difficult multiple choice questions and really get to some high level stuff, that's what I use once you've exhausted all of the GRE material.
That's a long journey. I didn't expect to hear that, but good to know. So, yeah, I mean, and of course, look, don't be afraid of that "it depends" answer, because that comes out most of the time. We have, I think, in this world, there's a lot of general truths, and you can advise people along a certain way. But at the end of the day, it always depends, and of course, because every applicant is different. They have different starting points and different goals, so it's totally normal. And schools have different policies, by the way, too.
Yep.
I was going to add to that a little bit. That if English is not someone's native language, it can be really intimidating, right? Because I always tell them this test is hard for native speakers. It's going to be, it's not just that that native speakers, of course, have an advantage, but they don't have all the advantages, because it depends on what language is. Even non-Americans often speak multiple languages, and that actually could be a benefit. You were talking before, Andrew, about how the vocabulary, how you can actually use different ways of thinking through. If you don't know the word, if you speak different languages, you can sometimes piece together vocabulary much easier than a Native American English speaker, right? Yep. So that's one way of actually being able to lean into your knowledge base. And like for us, we have our head verbal tutor is a PhD in cognitive linguistics. And so she actually looks at how do people think through language? What are the blocks that they have? And, she's been teaching with us for like 20 years and a long time, 15, a long time. And so it's, the reasoning that you brought up earlier, we can't emphasize that enough. Like having the reasoning skills and engaging with the test like it's a dance, and that it's not just a flat two-dimensional experience, but you bring your whole self. And when you practice, you practice to play. I don't know, you made a quote there prior. like you really want to engage. Like you can learn lots of dance steps, but unless you're actually listening to the music, engaging with the question, being present, that's going to have a lot to help you with, and trust yourself. Trust yourself.
I love that metaphor, like the idea of a dance. That's I might borrow it if you don't mind. But
Go right ahead.
but and one other thing that I'll say is, at a certain point on this test, everyone is a foreign language speaker. What do I mean by that? Well, the test is adaptive. So if you do very, very well on the first verbal section, you can bet, and I tell this to everybody, no matter what your score is, you will see words that you have never seen before. Because that's the point. It's not that they want to see how much vocabulary you know. It's that they want to see how you behave in a situation where you don't know the vocabulary. Right?
Nice distinction.
Yeah.
I'd agree. How would you, I mean, I know that in the past, both the GRE and the GMAT have the adaptive scoring.
Mm-hmm.
How have you approached that with students?
Yeah. And I'm sure, you know, like that is probably one of the most stress inducing parts of the test, is the fact that I like to say it's almost like, it's
I
like a
see
test
you.
Yeah. It's almost like a test out of Harry Potter, right? Like the test is changing like as you're taking it. And again, it's much more tricky with the GMAT because that's question by question.
Right.
With the GRE, it's so you take the first section, depending on how you do there, the next section is more difficult. What I tell students, and I'm basing this on my own experience from taking the test, is you cannot predict how you're going to do. You just can't. The test is designed to make that almost impossible. So you might feel like you're doing terribly. You don't know half the questions, but it could be because this section has got more difficult. So what the sort of mindset that I give students is, let the test measure you. Right? You need to treat each question as its own distinct battle. Do your best on it. But if you know what you need to know, the test will measure you, and you can't predict or hack it, right? Or anticipate how it's going to go. Just do the questions.
Yeah, I'd agree with that.
Yeah.
Don't let the questions do you, you do them.
Right. Right.
So, what other materials would you suggest besides the books? You said first dollar you spend is the official. That makes sense.
Yep.
Obviously, using a coach is something you'd recommend. Anything else?
The official books plus the power prep tests plus, you know, a supplemental book like Manhattan or Magoosh or Princeton. And again, I don't want to like officially endorse any of these other products. They're out there as good supplemental material. Between all of those, you will not lack for GRE questions.
Right.
Yeah.
I still look back on do you remember, I don't know if you were teaching this then, the big book that has
sure.
like 25 or 27 tests. And it was the days of analogies, right?
Yeah.
And it was the days of games, right?
Yeah.
And I actually, when we had ETS on, I was saying to them, you guys should really bring the games back. That's actually a really fun section. But I had no pull whatsoever. I tried.
Yeah. Well, fun is a relative term, right?
Oh, come on. You know it's fun. You know it's fun. Don't you have fun with those?
Well, you and me, I'm sure do.
Well,
I don't
that's
know.
okay. We have to imbue and inspire fun, right?
There you go. Yeah, I like that.
Right. What do you tell any of your students who come to you, like, you don't teach do you teach the GMAT?
I do teach the GMAT,
Okay.
but the demand in recent years has just been so lopsided towards the GRE, and so many students like come to me with the GMAT, and I'm very agnostic about it. I don't like counsel them in one direction, but I always say to them, hey, check out the GRE, see what you're thinking about it. And I'd say 2 out of 3 times they say, yeah, I'm going for the GRE.
Right. What are some of the advantages that you tell your students about the GRE over the GMAT?
Sure. So I'll say content wise, the two tests are about 80% similar.
Right.
Right. anything that you study for math on the GRE, you're also simultaneously studying for the GMAT and vice versa. The real difference is in the format, right? And understanding the logic of data sufficiency questions versus quantitative comparison questions. But that's a skill that you can learn with a coach or with a course. To give like a sort of a definite answer, the GRE, I would say, is better for students who struggle with math or who feel that stress over math. Because the GMAT, you don't get a calculator, right? On the GRE, you do. I'd say the student who might benefit more from the GMAT would be one who's very, very good at grammar and sentence correction and not so great at vocabulary. Because the GMAT has a grammar sentence correction section, whereas the GRE focuses on vocabulary. But this is a question that I've always kind of been unsure of how to answer, and I always defer to an admissions person, but I'd love to hear from either of you. Like, is there some sort of wink from admissions offices, like the GMAT is actually more impressive, or is it truly like we will accept either one?
In my experience, yes. My experience, even though almost every school, I'll just say this, every school that I've asked over the 10 years I've been in this industry accepts both.
Yeah.
And yet, I would say 90% of applicants go for the GMAT in the MBA world. And admissions thinks in terms of the GMAT. So if someone submits a GRE, they have to pop it into some kind of like converter, score converter, comparison website, and you pop in the two scores, and it tells you what that would be, the equivalency on a GMAT, and then they go, okay, I get that. Yeah, they have a rough idea. If you have 165 on each section, that's roughly, I guess, 650, 660. It's like kind of the acceptable range for a lot of schools, maybe not top 10, but for a lot of schools. It's just, it makes sense because the GMAT was designed for business school.
Right.
And I remember being out on the road as a recruiter, in talking like 2015, 16, 17, these years, and I would see ETS there, and they were trying to set the tone that don't think of the GRE as an alternative to the GMAT. Think of it as just one of two options.
Sure.
I'm not sure how successful they were in that, because it's still majority of people go for the GMAT, at least in the MBA world. But ETS has the benefit of every other subject being studied at the grad level that people go for the GRE. So, and they have the TOEFL. Let's not forget. So, a few cards in their pocket, or aces up their sleeve, let's say. Moving on, you mentioned some of the advantages. What about disadvantages, being frank? Can you share any disadvantages about taking the GRE?
Of the GRE. So is that the GRE compared to the GMAT, or the GRE as a testing instrument, or just disadvantages in general?
I will let you choose to answer that how you like.
All right. Yeah, I'll go with both.
I say compared to the GMAT.
Yeah.
What's the disadvantage of taking the GRE? I mean, you mentioned some of them with the vocabulary versus the grammar, right? Or the math. That's sort of, you did say that.
That is the biggest one, and really probably the only one that I can think of. And I'm sure, and I'm not, and I started out when I was teaching SAT and ACT working with students at a French school in New York. So I have a lot of experience working with students for whom English is a second language. But I don't know as a non-English speaker what would be more difficult, vocab or sentence correction. It might depend on what your native language is. If your native language is I don't know, something that's structurally similar to English, then maybe sentence correction would be easier. But if you're coming from, a language that's nothing like English, maybe vocab is, because there's a list that you can learn. That really is the only disadvantage compared to the GMAT that I can think of.
I would say
it's very personal.
It's very personal, but I'd also say with vocabulary, I remember when I was studying for the GMAT, for the GRE the first time, and before I was teaching it, that I was studying all these vocabulary words, and no matter how much you study, only a few of the words are going to be on the test.
Yeah.
And so you're actually putting out so much effort to study vocabulary when you're not actually going to get the benefit on the test itself. And so you just need to have that. It's just the reality of it. And there's going to be a lot of words that you just don't know.
Right.
And so if someone has memory issues, right, like they don't feel that their memory is that, and they're not working to make their memory just better in general, which, I mean, the way that I've told people to get their memory better is to become, you know, a wait staff person at a restaurant.
There you go. Yeah.
That's like a really good way to quickly get your memory in shape. But like there's all these memory games that you can actually play. But I think that if people feel that their memory is not as intact, that the GMAT feels a little more skills based than the GRE. And so a disadvantage is that you really do need, you totally need skills on both, and you totally need reasoning on both, but memory, I think, is probably more important on.
So do you guys think, both of you are in this side of things more than I am, do you think memory is something you can train or improve very much?
Absolutely.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
I forgot the question. No.
I knew you were going to go somewhere like that.
Yeah. No, I wasn't setting myself up with the joke, but it just kind of came up. I wanted to ask you, Andrew, how many times do you think you should take the test?
That's a great question that I might throw back to you, because ultimately, like, you're not taking this test for your own, edification. Like, you're taking it to get into a program. I don't know.
Let me rephrase that. I can answer from an admission side. And, a lot of people are nervous about taking the GRE or GMAT more than once, or they're afraid of taking it too soon, or letting the schools know about it because they're afraid if the score is too low, and then later they do get a higher score, that, they're going to see the previous score, which was poor, or it was somehow less. I was like, no, on the contrary, like, schools are used to people taking the tests 2-3 times, occasionally 4. That's borderline getting to be too much in my opinion, but like, okay, if you've changed your strategy and have a new approach and actually are improving, then why not? But in any case, taking it a second or third time is absolutely a mark of good character. Somebody who's willing to work hard to improve themselves, to improve their situation, to achieve a goal. Who doesn't like that? If you're working in a company and you're hitting a wall, you're not giving up. You're not throwing in the towel. This is an excellent character trait or personality trait, and so nothing to worry about there. On the other hand, there is a point where you're going to plateau.
Right.
Like I said, unless you're drastically changing your strategy. Or maybe you had the bad luck of having like 2 bad days in a row, or test days in a row, that you just scored poorly for an inexplicable reason, far below your highest practice score. So I'm hitting the ball back to you, Andrew. In terms of improvement of score, what is your advice about how many times total would you take? And maybe legally, can you take also? Lifetime limit.
Well, so what I would start by saying is, don't take your first test as like a warm-up, because there are so many practice tests, official and unofficial, that you can use to get a ballpark figure of where you are. So if you just drop a few $100 for a practice, not only do you have like a low first score, which might discourage you, but I would say if you're feeling like ready to go before you even start studying, please take a practice test, just to see it, like, just to understand the format of it, and get used to how the screen looks, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's very, I'll say from my end, it's very, very common to retest. And the general advice I give is that if you are within 2 to 3 points of where you want to be for your final score, that's probably when you should take it, because it's plus or minus. You might have a really nice day and overshoot it, and you might undershoot it. But here's the good news: the GRE, 15 days after you take an official test, provides a diagnostic report, question by question, what area it was, so algebra, arithmetic, geometry, data analysis, and then how much time you spent on the question. And that's usually the first thing that I ask for when I'm working with a student who's already taken the official test, is like, let's take a look at that diagnostic report. Because what you might find is, it's not an algebra issue or a geometry issue. You missed all the quant comparison questions, and you got all the multiple choice questions 100% correct. So we know where to focus now. So I'd say be very intentional in how you study. It's perfectly fine to take the test multiple times. I'd even encourage it, but treat those official sittings seriously, right? Don't treat them as just like this time doesn't really count. I would say only take the test if there's a reasonable expectation that you might hit one of your target scores in verbal or quant on that sitting.
That's good advice. Andrew, we have a question come in from Sarah. I hope we're pronouncing their name right. Do you think your point about memory applies to the math section of the GRE as well as the vocab? More than, I'm having trouble seeing this, more than math section of the GMAT. Okay. Yep. Andrew first, then Bara, if you have comments as well.
Yeah. So I'll say this: there's a lot of math knowledge that you need to have, especially with geometry. There aren't that many tricks when it comes to geometry. You need to know the area of a circle. You need to know the Pythagorean theorem. You need to know your special right triangles, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But keep in mind that the purpose of this test, or at least the target audience of this test, is not just, math nerds, for lack of a better word. It is the general grad school population. And because of that, for many, many questions, the GRE has to include, call it like a reasoned-based way of doing it. And I'll give you an example. A lot of times on quant comparison for a word problem, it'll say, what's greater? The average speed of this car from this time to this time, or 57. Well, you could spend all your time like setting up an equation and solving for what the average speed was. Or you could say to yourself, hey, like, because it went this fast for this amount of time, it had to be greater than 57. And then you've solved the problem. So I don't want to pretend like there's no math content that you need to learn. You do need to learn some math content. But I encourage even very, very strong math students always to take a step back and say, what's a reasonable way, and it is a reason-based way to approach this question.
Yeah.
Thank you. And Bara, anything to add to that?
Yeah. So what I would add is that because the tests are changing and geometry is not going to be on the GMAT, for example, that you want to really take a comparison to see. I would agree that memory is important for the GMAT and the GRE because you just need to know the equations, but you can also brain dump as soon as you get to the testing center. So if you get yourself into a practice where you are writing out, like, it depends on how you best remember things, but you can go to the testing center and write things out on your scratch pad, right? So that you don't have to depend just on memory, but creating the most ideal situation for yourself in memorization and using information. Andrew, I agree with you. Like, it is a reasoning test. And I also agree with what you said in a previous comment, which is it's how you get something wrong, not just what you're getting wrong. So it's really identifying what's actually happening to you on tests. Going back to like your 7th grade math teacher that made you feel weird about, exponents or whatever, that could be that you actually don't have an issue with exponents, but that you actually had an issue with the teacher. So it's really coming to terms with yourself and using the opportunity to clear the canvas and go in and just dance with each question and be there with each question. I also
We're back to dancing.
Like, you're not the first Andrew who likes that metaphor. So also you can take the GRE once every 21 days and up to 5 times with any continuous rolling 12-month period. So you do have options. And I agree, it's super important to know that a real test is a real test and you can knock it out of the park. And you don't want to get caught up with if you're on the GMAT, each question and, oh my gosh, did I get it right? Or what's going on and how am I doing? And you really just want to be just open to the process and being present with the material. So I do think memory is important on both tests, and it's just who you are with the content.
Very interesting. We have another comment that's just come in from Juan. How far can you lift your base score through the 6-month preparation period you suggested? I took the GMAT and I know the baseline score for that, so I wanted to get an idea of how I could do on the GRE.
Yeah.
Diagnostic.
There you go.
Diagnostic.
My answer. Take a practice test, right? Especially if you have been studying for the GMAT already, like you've put in the hours of learning the math that you need to know. Take a stab at the GRE and know that some of the verbal material is probably going to be a little bit tricky, like working with vocab. But I say to GMAT students, like moving from the GMAT to the GRE for math feels like what's in the Princess Bride when he's like, I'm not left-handed, right? You're like,
Yes.
you're switching, right? You're switching hands now, and it feels very, very easy. So diagnostic, exactly what Bara said.
Inconceivable.
So
awesome.
we're getting close to the.
Can I?
Do you have another question? Go ahead, Eric.
I do. Yeah. Well, when you were speaking about that kind of workaround with that test question that you were kind of imagining about the speed of a car and is it higher than 57, and instead of like calculating the whole thing, there's some sort of a workaround. And I've seen a couple of your videos where you do, I don't know if they're live or not, but when you, okay, so your live videos where you solve a problem, and I think it's really interesting, and it's a good thing you do. So I'm starting to think about like how questions repeat, whether it's GMAT or GRE. I'll ask you to speak to the GRE because that's what you know. Like, at what point in your preparation do you start seeing patterns repeat where you can say, I know this question, I've seen it before? They might switch out some numbers, they'll change it from cars to airplanes, they'll change 57 to 59 or whatever it is, How far do you have to be in this? How many months or whatever before it starts to get to that you can benefit from that?
Well, I'd say, again, that's kind of the benefit of having like following a structured course of study where someone can highlight these questions and say, hey, here's this type of question and here's what you do when it comes up. I do my best, though, to avoid giving and people ask me for this all the time, and I do comply, but like a formula sheet. I'm not a huge fan of having a formula sheet, except for geometry, because it kind of puts you in the mindset of like, these are the formulas that I need to know. And if I get a question that doesn't fit one of these patterns, like I don't know what to do. So any question that I approach with a student, I always try to take a few kind of perspectives on. I say, how could this have been different, right? How could they have complicated this question? With an average speed question, maybe, the train stopped for an hour. What do we do in that case? Right? It's much more about the framework of thinking than it is about being prepared for every single different, permutation or combination that they could throw at you.
Yeah. Now you've said something that made me wonder, on the geometry, how many formulas go on that formula sheet?
It's probably a page worth. What's frustrating about the geometry section is that there's a lot that could be asked, right? There's a lot of triangle and circle and 3D potential shapes, but only, and I'm going on the old version, only 3 out of 20 questions on each section are geometry, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. Guys, we got to wrap this up. We're right on the hour, and this has been a really fascinating episode. Thank you so much, Andrew, for all your insights. It was really great to chat with you, to meet you, and have you on the show. And of course, thank you, Bara, my dear. Folks, I hope this was interesting to you. I hope you learned a lot and why the GRE is perhaps the test that you should be taking. If you like this episode, don't forget to give us a nice thumbs up, and subscribe to MBA Waves to stay on top of all the good advice and information you're getting from our guests, and to get to know some of the business schools we have on the show. To check out the upcoming schedule, check out mbawaves.com. And if there's an episode or a topic you'd like to explore, feel free to fill out the contact form and let us know you'd like to hear from us. Thanks. Bye-bye, everyone.